All right. Thank you so much for being here, Paul. Wahid, I'm just gonna put you on mute. There's some echo
Yeah, I'm
that is
sorry about
happening.
that.
Yeah, echo happening from the back. All right. Thank you so much for being here, Josh Paul. It's an honor to host you. Like I said, we've been watching you do amazing work and then form a new policy with your co-partner. And we've been watching you achieve great success at Capitol Hill. And we would love to hear from you more. So over to you. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor.
No, thank you very much for having me. Really glad to join you. So I'm happy, first of all, to make this a conversation and to go in whatever direction people would like. Karina and Salman, when they reached out, asked me to focus on tech and the role of technology in the both US and Israeli tech sectors, in the repression of certainly the Palestinian people, also of American free speech. So maybe I'll just start off with that and a snapshot of where things are and where they may be going. But then, as I said, happy to keep as much time as possible for Q&A and to take the conversation either deeper down that rabbit hole or into any other rabbit hole that you all might enjoy or want to go down. So I think just to start off with a bit of a generalization, but I think an important one, which is about the nature of the US and Israeli tech sectors. Essentially, in the US tech sector, you see a sector that has broadly come out of civilian society, out of the commercial sector, and is being pulled towards the defense sector. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. The US tech sector greatly emerged out of DARPA projects and all this sort of thing. But by and large, when we think about the US tech giants, they are commercial giants whose products are now increasingly finding defense applications, or in the case of some of the new emerging defense innovators, new companies, but again, pulled out of that Silicon Valley commercial sector. By contrast, or by comparison, I think the Israeli tech sector is actually somewhat the opposite. It is a tech sector that greatly grew out of Israel's military and defense sector that is now seeking commercialization, commercial opportunity. Again, as with any generalization, there are some exceptions to that. But when you think about, for example, the role of Israel's military intelligence unit, Unit 8200, in spinning off a lot of the new Israeli tech sector, when you think about some of the specializations of Israel's tech sector in surveillance technology, for example, that have come out of applications, in the Palestine context. These are two fundamentally, in some ways, different tech sectors for which there is now a confluence, and I think it's a very worrying confluence, and that's what I want to sort of really focus on. So first of all, let's maybe talk briefly about, particularly in the last couple of years, Gaza obviously being the most important instance, but there's by no means the only conflict in the region. Lebanon, Iran, the role of US technology and tech sector in that, obviously most visibly takes the form of US defense articles, which of course are increasingly high tech if you think about the F-35. But there's also been an interesting increasing role, and I think in some ways a bit of an uncomfortable one, for these US commercial tech giants. If you think about, in particular, cloud services, Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, which have found themselves, I think, certainly partially pulled into by their own subcomponent units in Israel, but also in part by an absence of US regulatory infrastructure, have found themselves pulled into a military space where they have been relied on by the IDF for the cloud compute that has enabled a lot of Israel's application of AI and computing and other software applications in these conflicts, in target selection in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran. And we've seen a bit of a pushback to that, right? First, from within the tech companies, from some very brave, very bold people in Google, in Amazon, in Microsoft, several of whom lost their jobs over their internal protest. But then even to the point now where it's become an issue for these companies, to the point that, of course, most famously, Microsoft Azure announced that it was pulling back services for Israel's defense intelligence functions, because of some of these protests. Of course, there are also new entrants into the market that are seeking new areas of collaboration with Israel, and here we're talking about companies like Anduril, Palantir, etc., the Lord of the Rings companies, as we say. But that's been sort of the American contribution in the tech space in general. On the other hand, when we look at the role of Israeli tech, again, most of the weapons, most of the platforms, the hardware that is being used in Gaza, in Iran, in Lebanon, remains of American origin. And it's made by the companies, the Raytheons, the Lockheed Martins, the Boeings, the major defense companies. But what Israel has done is layer its own tech sector on top of that. First of all, in terms of surveillance technology, where, as I said, it is a world leader, in no small part because it has an unwilling laboratory of Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank to test, develop, and build requirements around. But then also with some of these emerging AI applications, and if you haven't heard of them, programs like Lavender or Gospel or Where's Daddy, and you can look any of these up. There's been some great reporting by 972 magazine on these, to essentially take big data and funnel it into essentially an almost no man in the loop targeting system, or very limited person in the loop targeting system. So that's those two sectors and where they've intersected in the course of conflict. I think it's worth also noting a few other things about Israel's tech sector. First of all, if you look at Israel's defense and technology and national security sector writ large, it is first of all one that has a track record of espionage. That's not a secret to anyone, right? I mean, the most famous case is Jonathan Pollard, who stole American nuclear secrets, spent decades in an American prison, and is now a member of the Israeli parliament. There have been other cases since then, and just in the last month, there's been reporting from both NBC and the New York Times that the US defense intelligence community assesses that Israel poses a critical espionage threat, which is the highest rank, highest level of threat a country can pose. And you might imagine places it alongside countries like China, Russia, etc. There's also, of course, a track record of economic espionage and intellectual property theft. And here, just to give a couple of examples, there's an ongoing case right now before both federal courts and the US Trade Commission, or International Trade Commission, from a company called Global Foundries, an American-based company that is suing an Israeli semiconductor manufacturer, Tower Semiconductor, over IP theft. Essentially, the Tower has stolen their processes and is essentially replicating their chip production process, at a fraction of the cost, because they never had to invest in the R&D to get there. That is a common complaint from US industry. I've heard it directly also, for that matter, from major US defense companies who have said, look, we've gone into collaborations with the Israeli defense sector, and before you know it, there is our technology, and the problem is a political one. No one in the US government is willing to raise a finger to do anything about that. Another example of this sort of behavior, different, but I think equally, if not more concerning, is, again, this sort of Israeli tech sector that is adjacent to the Israeli intelligence community. And think here of groups of organizations like NSO Group, the manufacturers of the Pegasus no-click hacking software, who have been sued now by Apple, have been sanctioned by the US government, although there's indications that sanctions may be lifted in the coming weeks or months. But essentially have been hacking into not only US software, but their technology is being used to spy on US persons, most famously Jamal Khashoggi, but also on US officials. And so that is also, I think, demonstrates a continuing sort of behavior of concern. The way I would think about all of this in terms of looking at the Israeli tech sector is frankly, you know, coming out of the US government and having served in the State Department for over a decade and other parts of the US government, there's a phrase that is bandied around, I think fairly, when it comes to how we think about the risks of China's tech sector, People's Republic of China, which is military-civil fusion. And this is the idea that there is no bright line, no clear separation between the Chinese military and Chinese civilian technology sector, because essentially what the former says to the latter will do. And there's an overlap of interests, of individuals, etc., etc. I mean, I think I would put it to you that actually Israel invented the concept of military-civil fusion, and we should be thinking about it in the same way. So that's all sort of opening and context to note where we are now, in particular where Congress is right now. So we're at a time where I think we're all aware US public opinion on Israel is transforming and doing so pretty quickly and pretty significantly. And historically, the US has been the major supporter of Israel in just about every way you can think of, most notably perhaps through its annual provision of billions of dollars in foreign military financing and funding for Israel to buy American weapons. You don't have to be a soothsayer, I think, to look at the crystal ball and see that the years in which Congress is willing to continue to write that blank check are coming to a close. That might not be this year, although there may be a vote in Congress as soon as the next couple of days on ending that military finance support. But it's unlikely to be this year. It probably won't be next year. But if you look ahead 5 or 10 years, I think everyone can see that day is coming. And so the question that Israel and its allies here face, I think, is how do you continue that defense cooperation and that relationship, and also how do you perhaps even extend, to some extent, Israeli influence in the US defense and tech sector at a time when it's increasingly unpopular politically. And a major part of the answer seems to be posed in the National Defense Authorization Act. This is the annual, quote-unquote, must-pass bill that provides the legal framework for the US military. It's currently working its way through Congress in the House and Senate. And for some of you, this will be new information. For some of you, you'll be familiar with it. So apologies if it's repetition of something you're already aware of. But in the NDAA, in the versions that are currently with the US House of Representatives and in the Senate, there is a section of law that has popped up, or a proposal, that does four things. First of all, it directs the Secretary of Defense of the United States to identify Israeli technologies for integration into future US weapon systems. Secondly, it creates a list of 10 distinct areas of tech collaboration and cooperation, including some of the most sensitive technologies you can think of, right? AI, biotech, quantum, for the US and Israel to collaborate further on. It then also encourages and incentivizes joint ventures in that space and also co-production by Israeli companies in the US. And finally, in the House version at least, creates an executive agent, which is a official role at the Defense Department, to essentially ride herd on this, to make sure it happens. So this is of concern, I think, for a number of reasons, right? And some of them we've already talked about, in terms of the inherent risks of opening the door to some of America's most sensitive emerging defense technologies to an ecosystem that does not have, to put it mildly, a great track record of respecting intellectual property or respecting, for that matter, American secrets. That's certainly one concern. Another concern, of course, is that once you build that system or that ecosystem into the US military supply chain, you're also giving it, and by extension its government, a significant amount of influence and leverage over the US, right? If we are dependent on Israeli technologies, subcomponents, whatever it might be, for our future weapon systems, that gives them essentially a valve that they can turn on and off to apply pressure both to our defense industrial base and through our warfighters to our politicians. So that's of concern as well. As is, of course, this notion that there's essentially a bypass for Buy America provisions through co-production in the US. So there is a lot of pushback on these provisions, but they are pretty deeply entrenched in the underlying bills, in the National Defense Authorization Act, and are going to be pretty hard to root out. And once they are passed into law, should they do so, which, if it happens, will be in the November or December timeframes, will be pretty hard to root out, right? Because it's not just about rescinding the law, but the longer the law remains in place, the more you have corporate contracts that have been signed, the more you have these joint ventures, the more you have research establishments making agreements, exchanging personnel, and so on and so forth. So that's all to say that on the one hand, I think you have a very clear picture of both the challenge of the Israeli tech sector and how technology, if it is not properly regulated and controlled, including American technology, can play a pretty malign role when it comes to human rights and warfare. On the other hand, you have a bit of a race against the political clock to try and not only do more of this, but entrench this in a sort of joint Israeli-US defense sector, which is, I think, something that should be of deep concern to all of the tech sector, again, both as a moral matter, but also as an economic matter. So a lot to talk about there, and probably not all that uplifting. But as I said, happy to continue the discussion on that focus or take it wherever you all would like.
Thank you so much for that, for all those insights, and that National Defense Authorization Act, that has definitely been a troubling escalation, and it kind of feels insane, like everything else, how despite the unpopularity of Israeli regime, the politicians are just literally not listening to their constituents, but instead further doubling down on that. Probably roughly half of the participants here are our American friends here, and you can see we have 4 questions, so we'll just take them in order. Wahid, Shahid, Chatad, and Karina. So Wahid, please.
Hi, Mr. Paul. First, thank you for all your activism and all your great work by leaving the Biden administration and standing up for justice. I wanted to ask you about 2 things. One is the recent Supreme Court decision concerning Cisco and what was on by Falun Gong against China, accusing Cisco of providing surveillance to the Chinese government, and the U.S. Supreme Court saying that they won't review that case, and that's a political matter that needs to be handled by Congress and by the administration. So human rights cases by people that are not U.S. citizens, I'm a U.S. citizen, very proud of it, but the ones that aren't cannot be pursued in U.S. courts. The second thing that I was going to bring up to you is, considering that decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, would you be open to supporting initiatives under universal justice in other countries to prosecute tech executives and companies that are complicit in genocide, like the ones you mentioned, Amazon, Google, Palantir, Microsoft, Oracle, in places like Spain that have had a track record for going against people like Pinochet, or in other countries where universal jurisdiction can be applied, and that these people can be brought to prosecution. Of course, U.S. would never turn them over. We don't expect them to put their billionaires on a plane and ship them to Spain for justice, but it would be great if they got an Interpol red card and a European arrest warrant, asset seizures, and it actually could help break up these tech companies. And there's a huge movement in Europe to move away from U.S. tech giants, and they're all talking about having their own AI, moving off of Google search, moving off of Microsoft platform, considering what happened to ICJ. Would you support that kind of an initiative?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thanks also for your kind words. First of all, with regards to the Cisco case, so I'm not deeply familiar with it, but I think at the core of what you're talking about is an obstacle that has actually come up in the courts, not just in that context, but in a lot of human rights contexts, including, in the case of Palestinians suing the US government over Gaza, and including in the case of Yemeni citizens, suing the US government over the use of US weapons in Yemen. And it's the political question doctrine, which is essentially an invented posture of the US courts to say that they will not weigh in on what are ultimately political questions. If there's a legal question, they'll weigh in. But if it's political, if it's for the executive and the legislative branch, then they're not going to touch it. I think that has been applied way too expansively at this point, and repeatedly and over, so it's built into quite a body of case law. But it is a real obstacle because on anything foreign policy related, the first response of the US government in any of these cases has been a political question, courts can't touch it. So that does open up the question then of if the US judicial system is not able or willing, what are the other alternatives? I'll start by saying that obviously it's a high bar, right? I mean, if you think about who would be liable in the private sector for atrocities, for genocide, for ethnic cleansing, for violations of international law, the starting point is probably the defense companies themselves, right? The ones who make the weapons. And there have been a couple of cases in which manufacturers have directly been found culpable. I think the most prominent, and I'm trying to remember the name of the case, was in France involving someone who was selling chemical weapons precursors to Saddam Hussein. But there haven't been that many convictions, and so as a practical matter, I think building the case against a tech executive when there hasn't even been a successful prosecution of a weapons executive is going to be hard. But I think there is an important point to this, though, and this is why I actually do think that this is a good idea. When I worked for over a decade in the State Department on security assistance and arms transfers. And in the context of the attack, the war in Yemen, a relatively junior lawyer in the State Department circulated a memo that warned US officials approving arms to the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition in Yemen could face prosecution by the ICC, could be in violation of international law. And that had a chilling effect, right? The memo was never officially approved by the State Department legal advisor, but it circulated, and people said, you know what, I'm not going to sign off on that weapons transfer. Boss, why don't you do it? And it got to the point where transfers that were ultimately made, authorizations that were normally made by junior officers had to go to the Undersecretary of State for approval because no one below that level was willing to put themselves on the line for this. And so I think that in any of these, there is a message that sometimes doesn't get across. I don't think we have an awful lot of economic leverage in our hands when it comes to companies like Amazon or Google. But we have to remember that each of these companies are led by individual human beings, and individual human beings, A, don't like to be accused of complicity in genocide or war crimes, and B, don't like to think that they can't go to Europe because they might have a knock on the door from Interpol or whatever it might be. And so I think there is, at the very least, an important, public relations is too weak a term, it's more than that, but an important psychological impact on these companies and on the leaders of these companies that does make them stop and think if they felt that there was any sort of actual personal direct exposure. And so, yes, I do think that this can be a useful tool in that sense. I would just caution against the expectations that it's going to, as you said, that it's going to actually lead to any prosecutions or, for that matter, convictions.
Okay, one quick note. There is a petition that we have with World Beyond War and Roots Action in supporting the Spanish judiciary in investigating these 5 tech companies that I mentioned. It's got 750 signatures. I'll put the link here in the comment section. I also asked Salman to forward an email to you to see if you would be interested in sponsoring it alongside these organizations as part of your nonprofit efforts. And of course, you're right. I don't expect these people to be prosecuted, but there could be a lot of public pressure that are put on them in Europe, where we're kind of our hands are tied in the U.S. and the judiciary process. And so please consider that email in your inbox.
Thank you.
Take a look.
I put the link to the petition in the chat. I think I forgot whether it was Shahid or Ted. Maybe we'll just go with Shahid, please. Sorry.
Hi, Josh. Nice to see you again. Thanks again for all the hard work you're doing. As you said, lots of bad news, but I appreciate you and others like you, fighting this tooth and nail. I actually want to maybe ask more of a hopeful question. We got some really good news last night out of New York. Just to see, like, you're much closer to the ground than I am. Have you heard any positive chatter or change in opinions based on some of the turnaround in New York that we saw last night?
Yeah, so actually, let me be clear. Let me maybe go back and clarify something I said earlier, which is that, yes, there is a lot of bad news right now, but if you particularly look at, excuse me, like what is happening in the US Congress and in the space with regards to, these technology provisions in the NDA and all that, they are happening because people can see the changes coming. And they're happening now because people can see, that Republican members of Congress can see, the government of Israel even can see, that if they don't make this sort of big push now, while they still retain the amount of power and control and leverage that they do, it may not be there after the midterms, and it certainly won't be there again in 5 or 10 years' time. And I think what we saw, in the New York primaries, and let's be clear, they are just the latest in a string of victories for candidates who are not afraid to be critical of Israel, who are standing up for Palestinian humanity, and we've seen that in New Jersey, in California, in Illinois, in Texas, for that matter. There is very clearly a building momentum, and what's also interesting is that while up to this point we've seen that momentum, particularly on the progressive left of the Democratic Party, it is very clear that the sort of ears are perking up in the Republican Party as well, to the extent that you see one of the two most likely candidates for the nomination for the Republican presidency, J.D. Vance, also beginning to step into this space and take on that mantle. And we can break that down a bit because it's not as clear-cut as it seems, but it is certainly significant that Vance is reading the tea leaves to some extent and seeing that there's a demand signal in the Republican Party as well for someone to step up and be critical of Israel. And so the bottom line here is that change is coming. And in America, unfortunately, in our system, it never comes as quickly as we would like it. But the reason that there is such a push right now to try and entrench some of these relationships in statute, in law, in ways that can't be undone, is because, if they don't do it now, they ain't going to be able to do it. And that's good news, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Ted is a former speaker as well and a veteran. Ted, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you. Josh, thanks for being part of this. I've got 2 decades worth of experience in foreign military sales, both inside and outside the government. I'm a retired United States Air Force officer, an acquisition officer, and I transitioned into foreign military sales. I've been watching how the U.S. government has been behaving for a decade, and the Yemen war crimes really got me activated and started my activism on this topic. And I could bore everyone for the rest of the meeting with all the different things that I've tried and what hasn't worked. But what I'll share with you now is what I'm pursuing are these chilling effects that you described. And I kind of saw them looking from outside of what was happening during the Yemen civil war and the war crimes that were being committed and U.S. government complicity in those war crimes. In about a year and a half ago, I declared that I was going to run for Congress, and I was a single issue candidate. And my campaign pledge was to seek the death sentence for the incumbent congressman. And I communicated this as best I could to everyone at the state level. I'm talking the governor, attorney general, the county level, including the sheriff, the city level, including the chief of police, and so forth and so on. as well as all the media that I could reach out to and all the contacts that I had. It was just ignored. But I think they got the message. Nevertheless, when the primaries came, I dropped out as a congressional candidate before the filing deadline. But I watched as 45,000 of my neighbors voted for the existing congressman. After dropping out, I waited about 48 hours and I announced my plan. I announced my candidacy for governor. And for that one, my campaign pledge has been the United States needs to stop funding Israel and end the longstanding abusive relationship with Israel, or our state will legally and peacefully secede from the Union and support other states who arrive at the same conclusion. Now, part of the reason I chose this approach was because I saw the realization among the public as well as at the highest levels of government that the funding was going to be an issue in the midterm elections. And that's proving to be the case. However, with my experience in foreign military sales, I also know that not just transferring of funds, taxpayer funds, but also the transfer of weapons or weapon systems to any entity that is suspected of engaging in war crimes or genocide makes that entity complicit in the war crimes or genocide. So I'm understanding that even if they do take away the funding, this integration, or well, I'll just say the transfer of weapons to a entity that's reasonably understood to be engaging in war crime or genocide makes those who are transferring the weapons complicit. And the only way that weapons are legally transferred outside the United States is through Congress. And so it puts the Congress, so part of my efforts have been to educate the public, to put officials on notice, so forth and so on. I note that your organization is, I used to have the, is involved in let's say advising or consulting regarding compliance with the U.S. Laws and regulations regarding arms transfers. It's more of an open-ended comment than a question, but I appreciate any kind of feedback or any kind of observations you might have, and I'll end there.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Ted. Appreciate that. And at some point, we can go offline and talk about Sapphire and all that stuff. But anyway, so first of all, I think thank you for putting yourself forward and raising your voice on this. I think it is very important. Whenever we can bring this into the conversation, to be able to do so. There's still a lot of Americans who aren't tracking these issues, who aren't familiar with what has been happening in Gaza, with America's role in it, and getting that in front of them, and also getting in front of them that, again, it's being done often or greatly with their tax dollars, and with, in many cases, the fruit of their labor. I think it's important when it comes to Congress. So there's certainly a lot more that could be done. I think the starting point for all of these discussions actually has to be that we don't really apply the laws that are already on the books. There's certainly space for Congress to pass better and more laws that constrain our ability to transfer arms when we know that they are likely to be used to commit war crimes or violate international law. But a fair number of those laws are already on the books. And particularly, in my experience in the Israel context, aren't applied. So, for example, the Leahy law that says that we cannot provide security assistance to units of a foreign security force that are credibly alleged to be involved in gross violations of human rights. I can tell you from my own time at State Department, there are plenty of Israeli units that are credibly alleged to be involved in gross violations of human rights. And yet, no Israeli unit that has ever been prevented from receiving US security assistance on that basis. So I think that this is also an important entry point with a lot of people to discuss this, because at the end of the day, this doesn't have to be a foreign policy question. This is a, do you want your government to comply with the law? Because if you don't, we're going to have a problem in a lot of other spaces. And I think that's what's been happening to our government, is that essentially there has been this, hole in application of law and law enforcement when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And that is, a rot that has now spread much broader in the system. And I think it's great to continue to bring attention to that.
Thank you, Karina. And then Mahmoud, please. Karina, please. Thank you.
Thanks. So besides groups like CAN, which I hope you'll share with the group about what we're doing with CAN, I wanted to know how much pushback there really is on Capitol Hill regarding the NDAA. And then also the calls that I have made with respect to Section 224, which is now Section 119, I believe.
219, yeah.
219. I've been connecting it back to the pager attack. My concern of having Israel doing manufacturing on our soil, I think about the pager attack and whatever they did to make that happen. But I'm also relating this to the fact that like a month ago on social media, it was going viral how one of the new iPhones has an Israeli-made chip in it, and how nobody's going to buy that iPhone or any iPhones going forward because of that. I don't really know how much, like how true that kind of fear is, but I have been expressing my fear of having Israel on our soil in the manufacturing business because of these. Just the pager attack is just so incredibly evil. The creation of voids that blow up, things that could come to our soil. I guess I'm looking for your comment on that kind of concern, how realistic it is. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, just first on the first issue you raised, which was the, how much pushback is there actually in Congress on something like Section 219? I think, the answer is certainly nowhere near enough. And, I think the bottom line is that if you had, an up or down vote tomorrow, I don't think you would have a majority, sufficient number to pull it out of the bill. I think we've got time to continue to build pressure, as this is likely to be, due to the way the legislative process works, unresolved for, at least the next 3 or 4 months. So we've got time to keep building that pressure. And I think, particularly after last night, to go back to, I think, Shahid's question, more and more Democrats certainly are feeling the heat. And I think after the midterms, more and more Republicans will come out of the woodwork on this too. But I do think that we are right now in a moment of particular risk when it comes to what Congress will push through. And I'm sure that's not only accurate when it comes to, in terms of US-Israel integration. When it comes to the risks of Israel in the supply chain, yeah, I mean, I don't anticipate Israel sort of, loading up American cell phones with explosives or anything like that. But I think what that speaks to is a willingness to exploit the commercial sector. It's that civil military fusion again, right? It's a willingness of the military security sector to use, the commercial sector to conduct activities that are in violation of international law, that certainly constitute, in other examples, espionage, as we were talking with the NSO group and all that. So that's probably not an ecosystem you want to integrate into your most sensitive technology. I'm not familiar with the Apple chip thing. I had read somewhere that Apple has also separately developed its own chip that specifically designs out the flaw that allowed Pegasus to function. But I don't know if that's in market yet. I don't want to weigh in on that because I'm not deeply familiar with it. But again, I think it's fair to say, if you're the US government, if there was an application or a technology in which you would not integrate a PRC-made semiconductor, you should probably not be integrating an Israeli-made semiconductor in that technology either.
Thank you. Mahmoud, please.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for. Okay, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Salman. So I have two questions. Basically, the most important one is for Josh. If you had unlimited resources, what would you do to take down AIPAC and the traitors working for it?
So, if you're offering unlimited resources, let's talk, because as a non-profit organization, that's always, unfortunately, top of mind. So first of all, I think part of the answer is you don't actually need unlimited resources. APAC has, spends tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in political cycles. $32 million, I think, was the spend against Thomas Massey, in Kentucky recently. But you don't have to spend that much money if you're winning, right? You spend that much money because you are trying to get American politicians to do something that is increasingly unpopular with the American people. And we've run the numbers on this, and AIPAC's cost of doing business is going up, and it's going up exponentially. And it's one thing for them to, as they did in the last election, spend $19 million or $17 million against two candidates, against Cory Bush and Jamal Bowman. It is another for them to be faced with having to do that in 40 different races around the country. And as we saw just last night, right, they spent a significant amount of money in support of Esbayat in New York, and he lost. He lost significantly. I think obviously, the more resources you have, unfortunately, in American politics, it certainly does help. But at the end of the day, it's not just about the resources. It's also about having the capacity. For example, within my organization, one of the things we do is we lobby members of Congress and incumbents on a daily basis. We need more lobbyists. We need to build those personal relationships. We need to build a pipeline of experts who can then, go and work in important national security positions. Because certainly AIPAC, if you think about the way they work, when a new administration comes in, they say, oh, here's someone who would be great for your Israel policy, or here's someone who would be great for your agricultural policy, right? Might have nothing to do with the issue, but it gets that foot in the door. We need to be building that same pipeline. So I think at the end of the day, with unlimited resources, you can certainly throw a lot of that into politics, but it's going to be wash, rinse, repeat if you're not building the infrastructure to make sure that you can continue at an institutional level and ultimately at a personal level, to build those relationships and to continue to restructure those incentives for politicians and give them, not just a no, but a better alternative.
What is the objectives or the goals, the end goals of new policy?
Sure. So I will drop a link in the chat to our organization's homepage. So we are a non-profit political organization. We have the main organization is a lobbying organization and advocacy, but then we separately have a political action committee, a PAC, to support candidates through funding, candidates and incumbents who are aligned. We're a single issue organization. We are supporting essentially policy change, but first of all political change when it comes to the US approach to Israel and to Palestine. And to the extent that we have to protect American freedoms and civil rights to have that discussion, because if we don't have the freedom to have that discussion, we're not going to make any change on the policies. Then there's that component as well. But if you go to our webpage, you'll see our policy priorities, which at the end of the day are Palestinian self-determination, proper application of American law to our security systems, eventually an unwinding of the US military and unconditional support for Israel, end of the US support for Israel's occupation. And ultimately, I think another important pillar of this is accountability, because that has been one of the missing pieces, I think, that has been both driving Israeli behavior and allowing the US to continue to enable it.
Okay.
Thank you, Josh. I had a question myself as well. In a way, a new policy is effectively the most effective anti-AIPAC PAC, right? That's pretty much. Is that a good way of describing it?
So, I mean, first of all, I think there's certainly a number of partner organizations that we work with And it depends. So I think in terms of the lobbying piece, then I'd like to think so. In terms of the campaign finance piece, certainly our PAC is doing a lot of good work. There's also a number of what they call super PACs that do independent expenditures that have popped up in the last in the current cycle that are also actually spending significant amounts of money in some of these races that are aligned. It takes an ecosystem, right? And when we talk about APAC, that's a bit of a shorthand because it's not just APAC either, right? It's APAC, Kufi, Christians United for Israel, DMFI, Democratic Majority for Israel, all of their associated super PACs, United Democracy Project, for example, plus this ecosystem of organizations that then sort of play defense for them, such as the Anti-Defamation League, which is basically what it's become. Anyway, that's all to say that I think at the end of the day, yes, we are fighting that fight, but I don't want to suggest for a second that we're fighting it alone.
Awesome, thank you. Colin, please.
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, thank you so much, Josh, for all the work you're doing. Personal question. I mean, this is about people and logic and motivation. It seems to me that prior to 2023, there was a sort of a smidgen of uncertainty that Israel exploited, regarding who were the bad guys and who were the good guys, right? But today, after approaching 3 years of genocide, there's no ambiguity. It's entirely transparent. The incitement to genocide is transparent. Why do you think it is that some people like you and the people on this call are willing to sacrifice their career, and yet most people don't seem to give a damn? I'm sure you've thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly thought about it, and so when you look at people who resigned from the Biden administration, at the end of the day, there are 15 of us who resigned publicly, and probably about 2 or 3 times that number who resigned quietly without sort of saying anything publicly. But we all sort of stay in touch, and that is a question that comes up. At the end of the day, I think it really comes down to a combination of factors. For me, one of them was professional. It was that I was in the part of the US government and part of the State Department that is responsible for security assistance and arms transfers. So these weren't distant questions or theoretical questions. It was essentially the hierarchy putting arms transfers in front of me and saying, "You will approve this," and me saying, "No, I won't. Goodbye." So that made it a very direct and easy conversation. But I think there are other factors as well. I think you also have to look at, I think financial security is important, right? So I used to have people, after I resigned, people would come to me and say, I'm thinking about resigning as well. Should I do it? And the first thing I'd say to them is, that thing that the air hostess or stewards say on the airplane, secure your mask before helping those around you. Because in our system, if you think about particularly in the United States, where your healthcare is dependent on your job, and you might have kids in college or whatever it might be. I mean, these are all factors that I think limit our freedom in a sense to make those sort of decisions on principle. And then I think some of it also comes down to personality. Some people are just more obstreperous than others. So I think it's a combination both of where you are, how much impact you can have, what your moral tolerance is, and what your social and economic capability and capacity is.
Mahmoud, thank you. Mohammed, please.
Okay, I'm sorry again to come back. Josh, I'm sorry, I want to ask you more specifically. What can we do now to the midterms to flip the political scene?
Yeah. So first answer to that is another link I'm going to drop in the chat, and Karina referenced it already, so thank you for that, Karina. So one of the things we do is we have an advocacy program called the Congressional Action Network. It has an ongoing sort of signal group discussion, but it also meets every 2 weeks to look at what exactly is happening, particularly in Congress, and how can we have the most impact, and how can we plug into the process. I would also, what state are you in?
No, I am in Europe. We in Europe now, we are waiting that things go south in the US.
Right.
So you take down APAC and the wave comes to Europe, because now they are winning, let's say, but public opinion is totally shifted already.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, okay, so
we are waiting for you.
I mean, I think it depends on where you are and all this sort of thing. But it's very clear that, Europe is underplaying its hand when it comes to what is actually happening in Palestine and in Gaza in particular. So, I think there are a number of organizations in Europe that are playing a much more active role here. At the end of the day, I think this is, someone put in the chat here a link to an organization called Bystanders No More, which is a UK-based organization, which I think is a great example of, their objective is essentially, how do you get people off the fence, people who've been quiet on this so far, to take that first step towards speaking up.
And I think it's a very bourgeois way. I mean, it's very for people that went to a university that have master's degree. You need to talk to the mass. You need to talk to the peasants, to talk to the workers, to blue collars.
Yeah, and in particular, I mean, I think that's where there's an opportunity in Europe that, frankly, there isn't as much in America, because if you look at the union structures and union capabilities, I mean, in Italy, for example, the dock workers union and others have been because they are much more organized in Europe than American unions are. They have been standing up more. I think there's an ability to leverage that to bring this issue to a broader cross section of European society. So I think it's about understanding the context that you're in and finding those opportunities. Because at the end of the day, this is in part a numbers game, right? And it's not enough to be right. You have to have the numbers with you, and the way you build those numbers is by building coalitions. And so it's about how can we take this issue and bring it to other coalitions, to other organizations, to other causes in a way that we'll back them, they'll back us, and it builds that number and finds the entry point. So the more we can bring this into new spaces, the better.
Okay. We need definitely to create like a central command room. From there, we send everything, and everybody will be acting at the same level. Otherwise, we're fucked.
Ted, please.
Yes, Josh. I know in the link that you put into the chat for the advocacy program, you're asking for the state as well as the postal code. And in my situation, when I declared my run for governor, and I left it open, and I also encouraged others to consider doing the same. I have property in 5 different states, and only once has anyone asked me in which state am I running, and I'm still looking at my options. How does your advocacy program align or take into consideration the residency of the?
Well, I mean, so at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is plug people into the process of American government, into their representatives in Congress, and to do that, we, to be able to engage with your representative as a constituent, which gives you a lot more, at least access, or at least they listen to you more than they do if you're just, someone from a different state. So to do that, we need to know who your representative is, and then we can also essentially do some power mapping and identify where we have voices, where we have opportunities, and where we can direct messages. So Congressperson Joe Bloggs is going to be doing a town hall next week. Not everyone in America needs to do that, but if we can identify 20 people in that district, then that's something that we can flag for them. So that's where that becomes relevant.
Thank you.
So maybe the last question, in the interest of time, can be from John. John, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Josh. I'll try to be quick. I'm calling from Canada, where we build parts that are critical for the F-35, among other things like explosives. We build them under the ownership of American companies operating in Canada. And we use that as a loophole for shipping weapons and weapons components to Israel. Are you a good source, or do you have good sources that would allow Canadians to get at those American companies operating in Canada more specifically than we've been able to do so far?
So happy to have that conversation. I will say that I understand that there is an ongoing, a couple of ongoing legal cases in Canada with regards to the F-35 program, in particular in exports to Israel, but also other weapons exports, given the nature of U.S.-Canada defense trade. And I'm lashed up with the legal teams on those cases. But if there are other angles, happy to explore. And if there's more information I can provide, happy to help.
If I were to send you a couple of specific questions by email, would that?
Yeah, you bet. And I'm happy to drop my email in the chat here as well, so everyone has it. There's no.
That's very brave of you. Thank you.
You're out there, right?
Yes, you certainly are, and I'm very glad you are. Thank you.
A lot of us in this call can very much relate to that feeling. Although, Josh, you're out there at a much bigger level, and we are all in awe of your amazing work, your bravery, and the way you have a gift of being an amazing presenter. I'm sure you know that, and staying cool under pressure, right? Like if I was having some of these interviews that I've been watching, I'd be swearing like Mahmoud. But these things, if you're in the capital, you got to do the things the capital way, right? And same thing applies in equivalent places around the world. Josh, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time. This was very insightful. Definitely a lot of amazing things for us to walk away with, and next steps we can take and learn from. A lot of us here are leaders in our own various initiatives, small things to make a difference. And so this was a great learning experience for me personally, and I'm sure for all of us here. Thank you so much for being here, Josh, and thank you everyone else for being here. I appreciate all of you. Our next call, our friend Mohammed Husni will be joining us live from Gaza, and he'll be talking about Bidra, and that's a initiative to reinvigorate the Palestinian economy through entrepreneurship. And so I'm looking forward to learning about that from Mohammed. He was on the call earlier, but we know that internet there can be very unreliable. So looking forward to learning about that with all of you. Thank you, and see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.